Hey, I'm Abbey.
And I'm Shannon.
And we're sisters.
My big sister Abbey has a Master's of Divinity from Earlham School of Religion and has been telling me Bible stories for probably 15 years.
And my little sister Shannon has seen 13 versions of Jesus Christ Superstar and has read parts of the Sermon on the Mount. Together, we're bringing you fun facts, historical context, and Bible stories.
Well, Bible stories according to you.
No, according to you.
According to you!
This is the Bible.
According to my sister.
Hi everyone, this is Big Sister Abbey. I have a few little things to say before the beginning of the rest of the podcast. First is that we found out that the interlude music did not work on the interwebs once we actually had posted it. I don't know why, it was definitely there, and I had other people hear it as well before I posted it. Who knows what happens? I will double check and see what I can do differently this time so it doesn't happen. And apologies for that. Technology gods do not like me. We're working on it. Second, Shannon literally had an hour and a half to record the podcast this week. We redid this awesome intro having the Tired Olympics where she talked about why she basically only has an hour and a half in these 2 weeks to record. And I talked about how life happening and exhaustion, and so words are hard and don't always happen when you want them to happen. And then we did the rest of the podcast, and we were about 30 or 40 minutes into the recording of it when I realized I had not actually hit record. So while I was able to kind of put together the Bible story corner, I was not able to redo the intro because literally Shannon had to turn around and head out the door within 15 minutes of us doing that realization. So it's not the best podcast, but I think it actually flows better than it will be, but you do not get to hear our beautiful intro. A million apologies. We will hopefully have a much smoother, better, fuller podcast for you on June 20th. And now I head you over, as Shannon says, to the Bible Corner. Okay, so this week I wanted to do a really happy story, at least a semi-happy story, because these past few weeks we've done really depressing stories. And that was harder than I thought. Lots of the stories that we can think of as being happy. It's like, yes, that is happy. And also genocide.
Are you telling me that you went out looking for a happy story only to read a commentary on it and find out it's super depressing?
No, I was like, oh yeah, we could do that story except for, this and that.
Okay. Did you finally land on one that has at least one happy interpretation?
Well, yes, so I decided to actually do a parable.
Okay, I like parables.
So this week we are doing the parable of the Prodigal Son, also, can you call it the Lost Son or the Lost Sons, and there's a few different names.
You hate that one.
I do hate that story, and it'll probably become clear because I'm an oldest child who, identifies with the older son in this narrative, but it's still, I think, a really good parable because it is on the happier side, and we think we know what it's about because that's how Christians have been raised lately. But there's a lot of things you can do with it, and we can't do everything that I found. I even just scratched the surface of the things you could do with this parable. So we're going to touch about it with a little bit, but not too in depth because it really can be, I think, interesting and the different things it can bring up.
Okay. So, actually, before we get started, can we talk about the word parable and what it means and, what all that encompasses? Because when you say parable, I think, the funny stories Jesus tells that may or may not make any sense. But is that what it actually is?
Got it pretty right, actually. So a parable is a short story that Jesus was telling in the Gospels.
Okay.
But we tend to think of them as being, really boring, that's a good moral story. But the intent of the parables were really to kind of throw you off a little bit. So they would have lots of tropes or things that people in that context would understand. And it would take that narrative and then it would just switch it just enough to make people go, oh, wait, what did you say? What did you mean?
They would have to be interesting because I bet they're really entrenched in the culture and the context of when and where they were told, which we may or may not have.
Yes, exactly, and we'll actually get to that a little bit later, but it was more than just a moralistic story to them. It was really engaging.
All right, so Prodigal Son.
So quick context, this story is in Luke 15. It only shows up in Luke. And it happens right after Jesus has been hanging out with some sinners and some tax collectors, and the Pharisees come to reprimand him. And in response, he gives 3 parables back to back. The first one being the parable of the lost sheep, the second being the parable of the lost coin, and the third being this parable about the prodigal son. And very quickly, the lost sheep is that a shepherd has 100 sheep. He loses one and he goes to find it. The second parable about the lost coin is about a woman who has 10 coins and she loses one, so she cleans her house to find that one lost coin. And that brings us up to the parable of the prodigal son. It goes something like this. Once upon a time, there was a man with 2 sons. And one day, the younger son asked his father for his share of the inheritance that he would get when his father died. And so his father went and he split his land, or his life, I think is another translation, in half, and gave the younger son his half of the inheritance. And that son then left and went to another city where he spent it all on excessive living. And then a famine hit, and he was without anything. And he ended up finding a man who would take him in and let him take care of the pigs in exchange for food. And eventually the younger son realized that he could go back to his father's house and his father could take care of him. So he had this plan and this message to go back to his father and say, "Forgive me, for I have sinned against you in heaven. Please take me back. I'm willing to work as a servant or a slave in your household." So he heads off and goes back to his father's house. Before he even gets close to this house, the father sees him and he runs out and throws himself at the younger son and gives him a kiss and welcomes him back. The younger son then does his message, "I have sinned against you in heaven, please take me back." And the father says, "No, you won't be a slave, you're welcomed back." And he calls for the servants or slaves to bring the younger son a beautiful coat and clean sandals, and calls for them to go kill one of their best calves for a big feast, and invites everyone to go and party and celebrate the returning of the son. Meanwhile, the older son is out in the field and he's working away, and he heads home and he sees a party going on, and he asks one of the servants, "Well, what is happening?" And the servant says, "Oh, it's so wonderful, we're throwing a party because your younger brother has returned." And the older brother gets really upset. And so the father finds out that the older son is outside and won't come in and is upset, and the father goes out and says, "Well, what's wrong?" And the older son says, "I have stayed here for years, slaving for you and working, and I have never done anything wrong, and yet you have never given me anything. You have never given me even a lamb to kill and have a party with my friends, and yet my brother is here, and you do all of this for him even though he's abandoned us. How could you do this?" And the father responds back, "Your brother came back from the dead. How could we not throw a party and celebrate him coming back to life?" And that is the end of the parable.
I get why you're mad about it.
Yes, so as an older child, I identify with the older brother, and we are just going to put that to the side and leave my bias there, and I'm going to talk about the rest of the parable.
Yeah, let's say it, and then we can put it aside. Okay, where do we start?
So the normal narrative of the story. The father is God, or kind of a perception of God, and the younger son is the people who kind of go out and they sin and live wicked lives, but if they repent and come back, they'll be welcomed back into the fold and back into essentially heaven if God is the father. And the older son is the people who are kind of, how can we welcome them back? They've been terrible, and not wanting to bring them back into the fold. God is the father saying, well, you need to welcome them back because they have repented. And so it's really about how you'll have the grace of God for if you have sinned and you come back and try to change your ways.
Yes, and that's what I had always heard in relation to that story.
So that's one way of looking at the story, but of course there are many different perspectives and things you could do with it. One thing that came up that a few people had pointed out, I'm not quite sure what to do with it, is that this was part of 3 parables back to back. And with each one the number decreases, so it goes from 100 down to 10 and then down to 2. And what does that mean? If we're thinking of the Father as being God cares if it's just, one thing is missing in 100 or one thing is missing in 10 or one thing is missing in 2. What's the level and emotion there? So a lot of people putting that out, but no one was quite sure where to go with that. But it was an interesting thing people
Oh, I was just thinking in relation to the other two parables that were told right before it, where it was like important to find all of something or to make sure that everybody is taken care of. When you think about it, in a series of stories, the last one is like making sure that you have all of your sons there and all of your sheep or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting and don't know what to do with it. But it's there. But looking beyond just that, there are other ways or other things people brought up. So in early Christianity, Jesus was seen as the younger son. Yeah. So Jesus left the comfort of home and God and went out into earth, or the place where all the excessive living happened, and he was mingling with Gentiles perhaps. And then he goes through punishment and he comes back to heaven, and in coming back he's, by this lesson, is teaching other people that they can come back to heaven as well. There's some interpretation around the older son being Jews who obey the law and get upset when other people then get the love of God, while the younger son is like the Gentiles, again with the pigs, and how now they are welcome and accepted into heaven. There is also the idea that maybe Jesus is the father, because at least some people say in the Jewish tradition, there was this tradition that if you go out and sin terribly, fall into debt or whatnot, and you come back to the community would have a ritual where they would throw down a jar and say you're now banished from the community, and that person would then be exiled. And by the father running out to the son, he's essentially keeping the community from having that ritual and saying, no, this person is coming and they're staying with us. They are not going to be exiled and put away somewhere else. And so, similarly, Jesus came in, and so the father would have come out and he would have shamed himself by doing this, because supposedly in this tradition, fathers were supposed to be stoic and not loving, and you weren't supposed to show your legs, and the father would have picked up his robes and run out and kissed his son and shown emotion, so he would have shamed himself. And Jesus shamed himself by dying on the cross. So in this sense, the father is shaming himself to take the blame and the punishment away from the son and putting it onto himself instead. Yeah, saying all that, there was another commentary which I found much more kind of interesting, which put aside a lot of what I just explained there.
Break it out, Abby. I'm interested now.
And it was written by Amy Jill Levine, who I believe who is Jewish. I don't think she's a rabbi, but she's definitely Jewish. And she points out a few really interesting things for me.
Okay.
Well, first off, she said we have to think about the story in context. And in context, the people who would have heard this would have been mostly Jews. And they wouldn't have been thinking it of a Christian context. They wouldn't think that Jesus was going to die. They wouldn't be thinking in terms of heaven and hell and right. Gentiles and Jews and who gets in and who doesn't. And the things that I had talked about, how the fathers would have been stoic, or the older son was about all law-abiding. It's this very underlying sense of Jews and Judaism bad, Gentiles and Christians good, and that things we have put on it in the past to show that Christianity is better than Judaism. And that's not what the story was trying to point out at all in the time. So one of the first things she points out is that the father being stoic and not loving sons is not a Jewish thing at all. You see stories throughout the Bible of fathers loving their children, and so why do all of a sudden in this story there's this idea that a father wouldn't love his son? So him running out and embracing his child and showing his legs and knees, that would be something that the Jews would totally understand and believe, because that is showing love to your child. Secondly, it would have been told to Jews who had a certain understanding of the way stories would have been told. The story starts off with, once there was a man with 2 sons, and that is a very popular story in the Old Testament. There, Abel and Cain, or Cain and Abel.
Isaac and Ishmael.
Yes, good job.
I got one!
Yes, you did. I'm very proud. It was a very popular story. And those stories always have this underlying thing that the younger son is the one who is righteous and who God will favor. And in this story, it's the younger son who goes out and doesn't do anything righteous actually, and so it's flipping the narrative.
He didn't do anything or save anything or become exalted in any way. He just...
Yeah, he's a little bit kind of worthless or not favored, not doing the good things in this story, which kind of moves us into thinking about the sins he commits. There's this weird idea of what is a sin. What we put on as being the sin. So a number of commentators saying, well, the younger son asking for the inheritance of his father was the sin because he's not honoring his father. And she said,
okay.
I mean, that's not necessarily a sin from the Jewish standpoint. From the Jewish standpoint, yes, it is about breaking the laws, but the laws really kind of boil down to loving your neighbor, loving God, and taking care of the poor and the widow and the orphan. So that was the bigger kind of sin. And if the younger son asking for this inheritance is a sin, then it would have been the father's responsibility to reprimand him or remind him that it was a sin. Now, granted, this may be, you can also see a parallel between the younger son and Joseph in terms of the younger son being more loved. Both get coats from their father, both are loved by their father. You could, definitely with Joseph, he was loved more than any of his other brothers. But you could also see maybe an underlying assumption that this father loves his younger son more to the point of foolishness, which is why he gives him the inheritance. But either way, the father is letting this thing happen. So even if it is a sin to let the younger son have this inheritance, the father is going along with that sin, which is an interesting commentary if you think the father is God. So the next thing, he goes out and he does extravagant spending, and she said, there could be a sin there, because if the sin is about loving and taking care of others and he just spends his money on himself, that's selfish, and you can maybe see a sin there. But that would be the major sin of the story, because the next thing that happens is he goes and lives with a pig farmer, and while it is a sin to eat pork in Jewish tradition, it's not a sin for Jews to be around pigs or around Gentiles. That happened a lot, actually, at this time period. So that in and of itself wouldn't have been a sin. And then she brings a really interesting, parallel, because again, remember, the Jews would have known a lot of stories, and you have to see these parables in the context of the stories that they would have already known. And so we always think of the younger son, he repents and goes home, but she says nowhere in there does it say he repents. It says he comes up with a plan to go back to his father's house so that he can get food. But it doesn't actually say he repents anywhere. And interestingly, he uses a phrase that is almost exactly what the Pharaoh says back in the story of Exodus, when he is in a terrible situation and before his heart is hardened, he tells Moses, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. And the phrase that the younger son wants to use on his father is, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. So it is a very similar phrase, a phrase that, they would have known.
But Jesus could be easily, quoting a movie, though. In the middle of this parable. He's just quoting a movie and everybody in the vicinity gets it. Except, we have to pick through it to get there. So...
Exactly, and that's one of the things about the parables, is that we have to remember that they're in context, and we don't have all of that context. They would have got it, but we wouldn't have. And taking it to the next step, so in some ways you could kind of maybe make the connection that he's just saying this to kind of get back in his house in the good graces. So what does that say about the story, if just to get something out of it and maybe he didn't repent?
Abby, I want there to be a point. My brain is scrambling for a point.
Well, I don't know if this is a point, but... both she and a few other commentaries I saw mentioned the point of maybe it's not the younger son who is the son that is lost. Maybe it's the older son.
Oh my gosh, the father is ignoring the older son.
Yeah, so
and he's so
that.
Focused on this kid that's not necessarily doing anything, and we're spending so much time, how the younger son is always the loved son, right? And the father is oh no, this is still the loved son, this is still the loved son, the older son is being really good. We should think about maybe both of our kids. Oh my gosh, Abby. Mind blown. There's the point. Okay, I'm happy you wrapped that up for me. My brain can stop hurting now.
Well, I'm glad you finally got a point out of it. Finishing it up, so maybe he's lost because of all of that. And then, the father's rushing out and he's giving his own repentance of, realizing at this moment that he has lost his older son because he hasn't given him what he needs and has ignored him and hasn't loved him in a way that he didn't because he had possibly a favorite son. What do you do with that?
Jesus could be saying, pay attention to those who are consistently being, good in this instance. Who knows?
Yeah, possibly. That could be something he was pointing out. But there's another interpretation as well that you can think of as maybe the older son is the lost son because he's the one who's been doing everything right and he's all about social standing or the correct moral compass or the expectations of the community, and in doing that he's lost a bit of himself as well. He doesn't know what he wants from himself in life. He hasn't experienced things in the same way, which is another what do you do with that question. And unfortunately I don't have a lot of answers for this parable, but that's one of the fun things about it.
So do parables matter anymore? I mean, they feel, now that you've told me more about them, they feel really grounded in a specific time period, in a specific situation, to a specific audience. So, like, I really like parables. I think they're really fun because they're short stories and they're, like bite-sized. But should we be putting that much weight on something that was so time-specific?
So all of the Bible is pretty time-specific in one sense. Because it was all taking place in a certain time, and there's certain context to it. But people throughout history and generations have found some meaning to those stories, even if they don't have the full context. Yeah,
but people have found meaning in fairy tales, too. And Harry Potter, and Star Wars.
I would say, because all of those have either stories that are really important in their context, because fairy tales weren't all the Disney kind of fairy tales we have nowadays. They were actually kind of teaching lessons to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And things like Star Wars have archetypes and myths that just permeate humanity itself. And so those all in and of themselves, while they may not have the same meaning that they did originally, they still tell us something really important about human nature and can maybe teach us things if we take the time to really stop and study them and spend time with them. I mean, I'm listening to a podcast on my free time about Harry Potter and how it's a sacred text and how we can read it like a sacred text. And I'm sure you can do the exact same thing with Star Wars or fairy tales.
Yes!
So the thing about the Bible is that it shouldn't just be read, it should be studied. And by studied, and sit with and look at the context and wrestle with it and say, I disagree with that, but I like that. Or why, like, it's not a document that's just supposed to be read and then put aside. It's supposed to be engaged with. And so I would say, well, parables were about a very specific time and situation that we're never going to fully understand. The people then thought it had a really important thing to say, even if most of them didn't understand it, because the number of times the disciples to Jesus say, well, what does that mean? And Jesus is like, okay, you're all idiots.
I just remember that scene from Lamb, this book we both really like about Jesus. Anyway, yeah, he's constantly like trying to tell them parables and they just no clue.
You can say the point of the parable is that you're not truly supposed to maybe get it. Maybe the point of the parable is to wrestle with it. And in the wrestling, something can come out. Because we just had this, like, moment, right? You've got something out of it.
Right.
So, are parables important in today's context? I would say yes. Even if we'll never understand what Jesus meant when he said them.
Yeah. I mean, even if you just find out something you didn't know beforehand. Like when you were, that Amy person you were talking about who looked at it from a completely different perspective. I learned something about the parable, but I just also learned something about Jewish tradition or, something like that.
I think that's all I had.
We covered some unique perspectives, though.
So does this mean we get to go to silly stuff with Shannon?
Well, I was just going to say, like, speaking of parables, this segues really neatly into silly stuff with Shannon. So, in the theme of me not having a lot of time. No, okay, how should I start this, Abby? I also love Godspell. My love for Jesus-related musicals does not end with Jesus Christ Superstar. Actually, I really, really like the Godspell movie. I might like it more than Jesus Christ Superstar.
Maybe it's a different kind of love.
Here's the thing. I could rewatch that movie over and over again. I don't like the Broadway revivals of it. Like, I don't like watching the different versions of it on YouTube. I love watching the different versions of Jesus Christ Superstar on YouTube, probably because it's, like, more soap opera-y and dramatic versus... You can't go wrong with melodrama, but, like, Godspell is definitely more, like, comedy vaudeville, and I think if you don't do it in a way that's funny to me or entertaining to me, it just comes off as, like, cringy and kind of weird. So I think it's hard. I think it's a harder ledge to balance on. Anyway, we're talking about Godspell today.
We are? Okay, so what about Godspell specifically?
Well, you said Prodigal Son, and that one of the parables they do in it is the Prodigal Son. And so the entire time you were telling the story, I just had the scene from Godspell in my head. But for anybody who hasn't seen it, some background information on Godspell. It came out about the same time as Jesus Christ Superstar. It was like a college project by the person who wrote the music and the person who kind of wrote the screenplay. And it's just a series of, I guess, vignettes of the parables and some of Jesus's sayings from... A lot of people think it's from Matthew, but it's also got, obviously, Luke in it. They go through a bunch of the parables and do them in, like, a very clownish, excitable style, and I love it. And there's music, and it's just happy. It just feels like a happy version of Jesus's teachings, and I love it. It makes me happy.
It kind of, like, tells the Jesus's life, or preaching towards, but like, in really interspersed sort of ways.
Yeah, but it doesn't do a lot of, like, the dramatic bits. Like, I don't think he raises Lazarus from the dead, and it has, like, a joyful spin on it. They, like, paint each other's faces, and they put on clown-ish costumes, or just, like, hippie-ish flower children costume, and they skip around New York City dancing and singing. So anyways, the Prodigal Son scene, let's talk specifically about that one. I was trying to find any information on it, but there's not really any, and there's different versions for different theatrical troupes. Like, there was one where they did hip-hop through the entire thing, which I did not watch. I can't handle trying to be cool. You know, like, when they're trying to be cool and it doesn't hit? Like, oh, we need to make Jesus cool. And then your, like, youth pastor starts, like, hip-hopping, and it just makes me real uncomfortable. In the movie, they had, like, clips from silent movies in the background while Jesus was playing, like, the musical piano in the front, and a couple of the characters were acting out the different play. So the entire time you were telling that story, I had that in my head. So the guy who's playing the Prodigal Son just grabs his father's vest and just slides to the ground and goes, "I have sinned against God and humanity," and just, like, throws his hand against his forehead, and it's super dramatic. I like it.
I'm shocked you would like something over dramatic.
So that was the first time I was ever introduced to the Prodigal Son story, and I just I remember Abby going, "I don't like that story," and then Mom trying to explain it to me in the way that I understood it up until today, where, you know, like, he came back, and you should celebrate when someone comes back to Christianity, or, you know, stops sinning and decides to change their life back around.
Which is not a really terrible moral of that story either, but
it is not. It's just funny when you have siblings and they're upset about those kinds of things. 'Cause, you know. Is there anything else I should talk about Godspell? I feel like I should save other Godspell vignettes for other days, and I can talk about my overall love of Godspell at another time.
This is your corner, or stuff, Shannon.
It is my stuff, but the problem is there's so much that I love about Godspell, I'm not sure I can fit it into a couple minutes.
Okay, fair enough. But I think that means it's time for me to ask you the question we always ask at the end of every podcast. And that is, Shannon, what is the Bible?
It's totally a vaudeville skit.
Love it. Hi, this is Big Sister Abby again with our last normal updates. First, as always, we want to say a huge thank you to Gutier's Happy Place for letting us use their music on Behind Things Like Right Now. Second, we are on iTunes, yay! So if you have enjoyed this, please like it or review it. That's how other people find us. If you want to contact us, we have a Facebook page at Bible Sisters, or you can email us at our new email address, thebiblesisters@gmail.com. And in the meantime, I think have a happy, great 2 weeks, and we'll be back on the 20th.